Maseches Ksubas Daf Lamed Vav. It contains one Mishnah, but is only one subject, both before that Mishnah and at the end of the Mishnah. And that's going through a list of women which we've seen in a Brisa or in the Mishnah that don't get knas if they are the victim of onus, of rape, or of pitoy, of being seduced. The Gemara is going to work through the list and discuss a number of contradictions and questions on them one at a time. So first, we're going to talk about an ailinus and a mima enes. Now, there are machlokes about each of those, and the Gemara is going to try to figure out who is the author of this brisa, which lists both a mima enes and an ailinus. So we'll discuss ailinus first. An ailinus is a woman who never has a stage of natrus. She goes straight from being katana to being a bulgaris. Generally, a woman develops somewhat at age 12 and develops more at age 12 and a half. From age 0 until 12, she's a katana. From 12 to 12 and a half, she's a na'ara. And from 12 and a half and up, she's a bulgaris. An ailinus stays a katana. She does not show any physical maturity. She stays a katana until she's 20, and then she turns straight into a bulgaris. Now, the brisa, which we have seen, lists that an ailinus does not have knas. The reason, the Gemara says, clearly must be because it is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who holds that only a nara can have knas, and an ailinus is never an ira. Therefore, she's never available to get knas. That is pretty clear that the author of that line must be Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim would say that she can have knas when she's an ailinus, and therefore this is pretty clearly Rabbi Meir. Now let's talk about mima enes. Mima enes is a girl who was married when she was a katana by her mother or her brother. It's only a marriage midrabanan, and therefore she could walk out at any point, and that walking out is called mia. Now, can she walk out? Up to what age can she walk out? So according to the Rabbanah, she can walk out until age 12, which the Gemara calls until she grows shtei saras. According to Rabbi Yehuda, she can walk out until she's age 12 and a half. Even while she's in naira, she could walk out, and that's what the Gemara calls ad sheyir ba shachar lelavan, until there's more black than white in the pubic area. The Rishonim explain that the hairs get long. Either way, the machlokes between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda is, can a naira do miyun? Now, the Mishnah had said, the Brisa had said, that as long as she's mima enes, she cannot get knas because she's not a psula, she was married. The implication there is that a woman of that age who was not mima enes, she was never married at all, could get knas. Now, what are we talking about? What age is this? So, according to the majority opinion, a mima enes has to be up till age 12. It has to be a katana. Once she's age 12, she can't be. But a katana cannot get knas. We just said a katana doesn't get knas, according to Rabbi Meir, and that was pshat in the line that said that an ailinus doesn't get knas, because a katana doesn't get knas. But here, we seem to be clearly saying that a katana does get knas unless she's mima enes. That's the only way to make sense of the line that says if she's mima enes, she doesn't get knas, which implies that a normal katana would get knas. So how do we understand this? That's the opinion of the Rabbanan. So the Gemara is going to try a couple of options here how to work it out. So the Gemara says, first of all, maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda, or it's really Rabbi Meir, like we said, it's Rabbi Meir who holds that a katana does not get knas. The reason why a mima enes would get knas if she wasn't mima enes at that age is because Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Yehuda. He holds that a nara, who's the only one who can get knas, a nara could still be mima'in. So if she's a regular nara, she doesn't. If she's a regular nara, she gets knas, like Rabbi Meir holds. But if she's mima enes, then she doesn't get knas. That's Gemara's first suggestion. Gemara says that can't be because we know that Rabbi Meir clearly holds like the Rabbanan. Rabbi Meir holds that you can only be mimayin up till age 12 while she's a katana. So therefore, we still don't have an explanation who is the author of this Mishnah. So the Gemara says, well, maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Meir that a nara is the only one who can get knas. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is the author of the one who says that mima enes gets knas, that a mima enes does not get knas, but a nara of that age would get knas if she's not mima enes, and an ailinus never gets knas because she's never a nara. Maybe we could say that. The Gemara says that can't be either, because when we discussed the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, we had Rabbi Yehuda Marav, the Amora, who said when we discussed the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that is, that only a nara can get knas, we had Amar Rabbi Marav Zud Rabbi Meir. This is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who holds that only a nara can get knas and not a katana. This clearly implies that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that way. So you can't say that it's really Rabbi Yehuda and he holds like Rabbi Meir in this topic. Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that. Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that knas is limited to a nara. So therefore, we're still stuck with Rakasha. We don't know who the author of the Mishnah is. So the Gemara says it must be a third Tana who holds like Rabbi Yehuda that a nara can can be mima'enes, and he holds like Rabbi Meir that only a nara can get knas. Therefore, everything makes sense. When the Mishnah says that an islandess doesn't get knas, it's because she's never a nara, and this Tana holds like Rabbi Meir that you got to be a nara in order to get knas. When it says that a mima'enes does not get knas, it's only because she's mima'enes. But if she would be a different nara, she would get knas, and a nara can do miyun, and therefore it makes sense. Now the Gemara gives another explanation here, which is not a different opinion, but it edits the words of the Brisa slightly. When the Brisa says that a mima'enes doesn't get knas, it doesn't mean a mima'enes. It means a person of the age of miyun, which means any ketana doesn't get knas, and therefore it's all Rabbi Meir's opinion. And he's saying that a mima'enes, meaning any ketana who's capable of doing miyun, doesn't get knas, as well as any, because like he holds, you got to be a nara in order to get knas, and then he also adds that an islandess doesn't get knas, and that would be because she's never a nara at all. So the Gemara asks if that's what it means to say. Why does it say mima'enes? It's just a ketana straightforward, and the Gemara leaves that as a kasha. We don't have an answer for that. Now the Gemara goes on to discuss islandess more in detail. Islandess, we saw in our Brisa, does not get knas. The Gemara has a kasha. We have a Brisa that says an islandess does get knas. Now there's more in this Brisa, which we'll discuss shortly. But first let's focus on this contradiction. One Brisa says an islandess gets knas law, and another Brisa says she does not get knas. And Gemara says that's not a kasha. Obviously, Rabbi Meir holds an islandess can't get knas because she's never a nara. The Rabbanan would say an islandess could get knas because the ketana can get knas. It doesn't matter that she's not a nara. So Gemara says the person who brought this kasha to the Beis Medrash, what was he thinking? This is an obvious answer. So Gemara says he brought it to the Beis Medrash because he really had a kasha on a different part of the Brisa. The Brisa also said that a chareshes and a shota, as well as the islandess, they all get knas. And then it said about all three of them that they have tainas b'sulim. Tainas b'sulim means that if somebody marries them and finds that she's not a b'sula, he could claim, I'm not giving you your full ksuba. I only promised you your full ksuba because I thought you were a b'sula. Turns out you're not. So this Mishnah says, so that's a valid claim even against a chareshes and a shota. Shota is these are women who are not fully mentally functional. So where it says that this is a contradiction to a different Brisa that says that a chareshes and a shota do not have tainis psulim. You cannot taina, I thought you were a psula, because since they can't take care of themselves, then you cannot assume that they are a psulim. They could have lost their psulim in all kinds of different ways. Now, there's more in this Brisa too, which we'll discuss shortly. But first, let's resolve this contradiction. And this was the kasha. The Gemara says that why this Brisa was brought into the Beis Medrash in the first place to discuss, and that's why we asked about islandess. But here we see a contradiction as to whether or not a chareshes and a shota have tayanis psulim. So that means there's a contradiction. Can we claim against him? I thought you were a psula. So the Gemara says it's not a kasha. One Brisa is Rabbi Gamliel, one Brisa is Rabbi Yeshua. What's that? So we saw Rabbi Gamliel early in the Masechta said that if a woman is accused of not being a psula, and she says, you're right, but I was a psula at the time that we had Erusin, the time we got engaged, we did Kedushin, but I was raped from afterwards, and therefore it's not my fault, it's your loss. So Rabbi Gamliel says she has a right to say that taina, and she wins the case. Rabbi Yeshua says she doesn't have a right to say that taina. Now, Rabbi Gamliel, therefore, she has a taina that wins. So we would taina that on behalf of the cheresh and the shota. We will say for her, she doesn't have the functionality to make this claim herself, but we'll say for her, she was probably nenas after the Erusin happened. So the Gemara says, how do you know that Rabbi Gamliel would say that for her? We saw that Rabbi Gamliel says if she says that, she wins. It doesn't mean we'll go say it on her behalf if she doesn't say anything. The Gemara says no. We have a rule called psach pichal le'ileim. Somebody who cannot claim for themselves, the court will claim for them. Whatever claim will win, and therefore she will not lose her ksuba because we will claim for her that she was nenas from after Erusin. Now Rabbi Shua holds that taina doesn't work anyway, so therefore he's the author of the Brisa that says that she does lose her ksuba because there's no taina that could save it for her. Now, let's go back to the Brisa and see whatever else it said. They would also said that a bogeres, that's a woman who's above the age of 12 and a half, there's no tainas b'sulim on her because because of age, loses her b'sulim naturally. So you can't claim anything. So the Gemara says there's a problem on that, and that's because we've seen in the halachos of Nida, a woman who in her first bia bleeds, we assume that it's blood coming from the psulim, not coming from dam nida. And therefore she doesn't have to separate from her husband because of nida. So we said that the halacha over there is that the entire first night, no matter how many bias she does, we hold that she can say that we can assume that it was all from the psulim, and we don't say that she became a nida. Now, the problem is if she's a bogeres, and you're telling me that a bogeres doesn't have psulim necessarily, so how could you keep saying, oh, it's dam psulim, it's dam psulim, it's dam psulim? She doesn't have dam psulim necessarily. So, okay, one time, maybe, but the whole night we should assume that. So the Gemara says, so it's as follows. You're right, she does have blood. And if she doesn't bleed, and the guy, her husband, comes and says she didn't bleed, and if I think she wasn't a psula, I want her to lose her ksuba, there he has a good taina. This Mishnah, when it said that she does not have tainas psulim, you can't claim she loses her ksuba. That's talking about where he came and he said the opening was too big. It seemed like she had bia before because of the size of the opening. That claim you can't make against a bogeres because her psulim naturally fade away, and therefore that's not a claim. However, they are still there, and there should be blood. And when we said there's no tainas psulim, it's talking about where the guy had no time about the blood. He didn't notice if there was blood or not. That wasn't part of his claim. All right, now the Gemara goes to analyze the next line, and that's the opinion of Sumchis. Sumchis and the Tanakama there have an argument about a blind woman. The Tanakama says a blind woman, you could have tainas psulim against her, and Sumchis says there's no tainas psulim against a blind woman. Gemara says, why not? Why should she not? Why is there no assumption that she was a psula just because she's blind? So the Gemara says, naturally you cannot assume that because a blind woman trips and falls and she can injure herself and lose her psula. The Gemara points out any woman that could happen to anybody. The Gemara says, no, any other woman that it happens to, or any other girl that happens to, will notice that she lost her psulim. She'll see the blood and she'll go tell her mother, and therefore we will know that she lost her psulim through an accident. A blind woman could be that she was not aware of it, she never told her mother, and therefore there's no claim against her that she's not a psula. All right, we now refer way back to our previous brisa on the last daf, and we've seen on the list that a woman who has a shem ra against her, that is, she was accused of being unfaithful, of not being proper behavior, and therefore losing her psulim, she cannot claim knas if she is raped. So the Gemara says, what's that referring to? Why can't she claim knas if it's referring to where we found that she was really mezaneh? So she gets skila for that. So what are you saying? He's saying she won't get knas. She's not going to get her life. She's going to get skila for that. So we're not talking about where we actually have established that she was mezaneh. We're talking about where she had a reputation of being inappropriate behavior, of being disreputable. And somebody who has that reputation, and somebody goes and marries her, he can't say, oh, I'm not going to give her that. We were not going to say that he has to pay knas because we assume that she's not. The assumption on her is that she wasn't a psula because she has this reputation. Says the Gemara, this is very similar to a contract where there's rumors flying around that this contract is a forged contract. You can't use it to collect. So the Gemara says, hold on a second, let's analyze this. When we say rumors, what do we mean? We mean that just people are talking, people are saying that she was misbehaved, and people are saying that the contract was forged. That wouldn't be correct. The halacha is if there's just people talking, that's not enough to make a woman lose her right to her ksuba. It's not enough to have a claim against a woman. So that can't be what we mean. Now Rashi points out we can't mean that there are two Edom who are testifying that she was mezaneh or testifying that the contract is forged, because then there's no chiddush and then she gets actual skila. So we have to be talking about something else. So the Gemara says we're talking about where two people come and say she came to us and tried to get us to be mezaneh with her. So therefore we know through testimony that she was looking for znus. So Gemara says now I have a kasha because these two things aren't comparable. A woman who's looking around for znus is going to find somebody. If we know we've established by two witnesses that she was looking for znus, she'll find someone. But just because someone is looking for someone to forge a contract for him, if you have two witnesses and say that he came to us and asked us to forge for him, doesn't prove that he found somebody. Just because he's looking to forge doesn't mean somebody's going to do the forging. So Gemara says no, because there's always the possibility that he'll be able to forge it himself. Worst comes to worst, he'll take a shtar, he'll analyze the signatures, and he'll go ahead and forge them on his own. And therefore, forging is always a possibility. If somebody was looking for it, he'll find it, and therefore you can't collect with that shtar. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses two additional categories of women who are not entitled to knas. The first is women who are migayer at some point, and therefore we always assume in that there was inappropriate behavior before the gerus, and therefore they are not psulim, and you have to be psula in order to be entitled to knas. So they are a giores or a captive or a shivcha that was migayer or redeemed or freed after being older than 3 years. We've seen under 3 years psulim return, but these were in the state of being either an akum or a captive or a shevcha over 3 years. So here you actually have Machokas. Tanna Kama says you assume that they're not psulim, therefore they don't get Knas. And Rabbi Yehuda says we say that a shvuya is different. Even though she was captured, we still assume that she's biktusha. So we assume nothing happened to her. We assume she was not contaminated and used by the captors, and therefore she's still considered to be a psula, and she still is entitled to Knas. Now, the second category is women who are too close of a relative, and therefore the person who's ma'anis them gets misa biad vezin for what he did. And then you have the rule of kamle b'dirami minei. If he's getting misa, he doesn't have to pay knas. Those relations are his daughter or his granddaughter through either a son or a daughter, or his wife's daughter or granddaughter through either a son or a daughter. Here the Mishnah gives us the source for Kamle B'Ravine. It says in the case of a man who accidentally kills someone, it says Im lo ason, if she did not die, anish, he will get the financial punishment, which implies that if she did die, he won't get the punishment, and that's again because of Kamle B'Ravine. So the Gemara focuses on the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda over here said that a captive woman is assumed to still get knas. That means we're assuming that she's still a psula and nothing happened to her. That sounds like the same opinion as Rabbi Zelisa, who saw in a brisa that she's still allowed to eat truma. She's married to a kohen, she's still allowed to eat truma. Now, had she been a nenas and therefore had a bia with a person who's puzzle, who would puzzle her to truma, such as the guy who captured her, she would not be allowed to eat truma. The Gemara quotes what Rabbi Zelisa says. He says that we assume that even though she was captured by an Arab, Tosfos explains that the Arab were considered to be the most involved in Zima and therefore the most likely to do something. He most likely touched her in an inappropriate way, but we don't assume that he went so far as to do an actual onus and an actual bia, and therefore she's not puzzle to kahuna. So what we have is that Rabbi Yehuda says we assume that she's tahar as far as she's soon to be a psula and she can still get knas. And Rabbi Zelisa says she's assumed to be tahar in the fact that she's allowed to eat truma. Says the Gemara, maybe those halachas are different. How do you know that they both agree to each other? Maybe Rabbi Yehuda would not say it about truma. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda said we assume that she's pure because we don't want the person who captured her and was ma'anis her to now get scot-free from the knas that he has to pay. Because if he went ahead and he made her no longer psula, then he'll be ma'anis her later. Then he'll say, haha, now I don't have to pay knas because she was a shuya before. Very funny. That would be a choti niskar, that he gets a benefit out of the sin that he did. We don't want that to happen. But in the case of truma, where nobody's being niskar, the fact that she won't be able to eat truma afterwards is not any schar to him. So maybe we wouldn't say that. Says the Gemara, you could say the same thing about Rabbi Zelisa as well. Maybe he only says it as far as truma goes. Truma bisman is only derabanan. So to allow her to do something which might be an iser derabanan, that she'll be a woman who was nenas by her captor and she'll eat truma. That's only truma midirabanan, not such a big deal. But knas, that's a question of taking money away from somebody, which is an iser deraisa. Would we allow that to happen if it's a question of a deraisa? Maybe Rabbi Zelisa would not say that. Now, the Gemara points out that Rabbi Yehuda also says his halacha in a different case. He also says his halacha as far as ksuba. He says that even if she was captive, she still gets a regular ksuba of masayim. That means we're assuming that she's a psula as far as halachas ksuba. Now there's no chote niskar. So why would we allow that? If his reasoning was only because of chote niskar, that the guy shouldn't gain and not have to pay the fine. So Gemara says there's a parallel factor to chote niskar there, and that's we want to make sure that she has the ability to get married. And if we're going to take away part of her ksuba, people are going to say obviously she's not. She's assumed to not be pure, and they're not going to want to marry her. Therefore, to protect her marriageability, that's why we would give her the full ksuba, but not without any of these two factors, such as truma is concerned, and maybe we wouldn't say that. Now, the Gemara is a kash on what we're saying here, that Rabbi Yehuda holds, we assume that she's still biktushaza, that she wasn't nenas in her captivity. And that's a brisa that talks about when she's redeemed, who's allowed to marry her? So the Brisa talks about somebody who redeemed her and somebody who redeemed her and testifies that he knows that she was pure. So the Gemara says that according to the Tanna Kama there's a difference between the two. Somebody who redeemed her is allowed to marry her, and somebody who testified is not allowed to marry her. So Gemara says that doesn't make sense. Hold on a second. Before we even get to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, if he redeemed her and he testified, if he redeemed her, he's allowed to marry her. If he can also testify that she's pure, he's not allowed to. How does that make sense? The Gemara says, no, we're talking about different people. We're talking about someone who redeemed and testified, that's one person, and then we're talking about someone who just testified. We have to be talking about two people who come and they claim, I'm testifying that she's pure and I would like to marry her. So there the halacha is as follows. This is what we have in our edited version. If he is coming and he wants to marry her and he says, I know that she's pure. So if he also redeemed her, so then the Tanna Kama says he's allowed to marry her. But if he didn't redeem her, he just says, I'm testifying, then he's not allowed to marry her. And that's because we assume he's lying. We assume that he just wants to marry her, and therefore he claims to have testimony that she's pure. If, however, he actually redeemed her, so he invested money in it, then he wouldn't do that unless he knows for sure. So that's the Tanna Kama's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says either way he's not allowed to marry her. So we see clearly that Rabbi Yehuda holds that she's not assumed to be pure. So how could we say here in our Mishnah that he holds that she is? So the Gemara has two approaches. The Gemara first of all says you have to change Rabbi Yehuda. He must say that either way he is allowed to marry her, not either way he is not. Or we could say that Rabbi Yehuda himself holds that way, holds either way he's allowed to marry her. He's just talking to the Chachamim, and he's saying, look, I hold it either way he's allowed to marry her. I'm just saying what you're saying don't make sense. Why should he differentiate between whether he redeemed her or not? If he's testifying, he says he knows she's pure, so he should be allowed to marry her. And the Rabbanan respond and they say no, because we don't really trust his testimony. We assume he has ulterior motives because he wants to marry her and he's testifying falsely. But if he actually spent money, so then we assume he must actually know.